I picked up the phone, hesitantly but with a determination I had never felt before. The weight of that decision squeezed my chest and, even so, I knew I needed to do it. I had already seen all the hidden messages, the forced smiles, the lame excuses. There was an unknown number that she insisted on protecting, and every time I questioned it, she dismissed it, saying it was a work thing. But I already knew everything. So, finally, I made the decision to call him, the man who had taken what was mine, who had turned my life upside down. On the other end of the line, a calm and carefree voice answered, unaware that I was about to destroy the false comfort he hid in. "Hello?" he said, and for a moment I hesitated, the sound of his voice reaching me like bitter confirmation. It was real. She had lied to me, she had slept with him, she had built a world of secrets and lies that would collapse in that very phone call. Before I could respond, I heard something in the background. A laugh I knew well, a sound that once brought comfort but now burned like acid. It was her voice. She was with him, at that exact moment, as I held the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had been the fool for so long, thinking I could save our marriage, thinking there was still something that could be salvaged. "Do you want her?" My voice came out firmer than I expected, a mix of anger and sadness so deep it almost didn't sound like me. "You can keep it. I'm divorcing her now." There was silence on the other side, and I imagined the two of them looking at each other, stunned, not knowing what to say. I didn't want to know how he would react, I didn't want to hear her panic when she realized I knew everything. But at the same time, I wanted them to feel the weight of my pain, the weight of having thrown everything away. When I hung up, the silence in the house seemed more deafening than ever. I had said those words without thinking about the consequences, but I knew there was no going back. Now, it was a matter of survival, of picking up the pieces of what was left of my life and trying to find some dignity in the midst of all that betrayal. It all started subtly, small signs that I preferred to ignore. A discreet laugh when reading a message on your cell phone, a last-minute appointment, explanations that didn't make sense. But when the lies started piling up, I knew something was wrong. These weren't just excuses for work dates, there was something more. And I, blinded by the desire to believe we were okay, let her pull the wool over my eyes. For a while, it even worked. I started to notice that the apologies became more frequent, that she was increasingly distant, but I wanted to believe that it was just a phase. Until the day I decided to check her cell phone while she was taking a shower. And there it was, in the call history, the name I had never seen before. A sequence of messages that chilled my spine. She spoke to him in a way she hadn't spoken to me in years. And then, I knew. This wasn't just a one-night stand, it wasn't just a distraction. They were experiencing something that she no longer had with me. I waited to see how far it would go. I waited because, deep down, I still had hope that she would come back to me, that she would realize her mistake. But every night she went out, every time she told me she was too tired to talk, I sank a little deeper into the abyss of doubt. And so, that night, when she said she was going out to do something urgent, I followed her. I followed her and saw what I never wanted to see. She didn't know I was there, but I saw everything. She got into his car, and I saw the smile she reserved just for him. I saw her lips touch his, without haste, without guilt. I stayed there, hidden in the shadows, until they left. I returned home with my head full of images that I couldn't erase, with my heart broken in a way I never imagined was possible. When she came back that night, I pretended to be asleep. She lay down next to me as if nothing had happened, and I hated how easily she lied. I hated the fact that she had become a stranger, that sweet smile that won me over was now turned toward another man. I spent the next week watching her every move, waiting for some reaction, waiting for her to confess. But she didn't. She was too good at lying, at hiding the truth behind a veil of normality. Until, finally, I decided to act. I called him. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I knew I needed to hear that man's voice, to know who I was dealing with. And the cruel irony of fate is that when he answered, she was there. Laughing. Without knowing that I was on the other end of the line, listening to everything. I wonder, even now, how she could do this to me. How could you destroy everything we built, everything I believed was solid, just to live one lie next to another? Did she think about me while she was with him? Did you, at some point, feel guilty about everything you were doing? Or did he simply get lost in a fantasy that he didn't have the courage to end? I don't know. Maybe I'll never know. But at that moment, I only wanted one thing, for them to feel the impact of my words, for them to know that there was no going back. But what I didn't expect was his reaction. I didn't know you knew, he stuttered. And then something in his voice changed, a hesitation that I didn't immediately understand. Listen, I think that was a mistake. An error. Anger bubbled up inside me. How could anyone call it mistake after all? He tried to explain himself, said he never wanted it to go that far, that he didn't want to hurt anyone. And at that moment, it hit me. He was scared. Fear that I would destroy the illusion he had created for himself, that I would bring to light a reality he didn't want to face. You can have it, I said, and I felt the bitter taste of those words. I'm divorcing her now. But the silence that came after was the most revealing of all. Because, for the first time, I realized that maybe he didn't want her as much as she wanted him. Maybe she had bet all her chips on a relationship that wasn't as safe as she thought. And now, it was my turn to find out what would be left when all the masks fell. And what I saw after that connection, what I discovered in the weeks that followed, changed everything. Welcome to our channel. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they show in a raw and realistic way how betrayal can destroy lives, loves, and trust. Each narrative is a powerful warning about the devastating consequences of poor choices. Get ready for a shocking story, full of twists and intense emotions. Happy listening. James and Emily have always been seen as the perfect couple. They met in college, when he was studying business administration and she was studying graphic design. From the beginning, there was a natural connection between the two, something that went beyond physical attraction. They seemed to understand each other in a way few people could, completing each other's sentences, laughing at the same jokes and sharing the same dreams for the future. Soon after graduating, they decided to get married, and the small, intimate ceremony was the materialization of a love that seemed to know no obstacles. For years they were happy. At least that was how everyone around him saw the relationship. James, in his early 30s, was a dedicated and pragmatic man. He always had a sense of responsibility that bordered on perfectionism. She was the type who prided herself on keeping her life organized, her bills up to date, her house always tidy and a clear plan for the future. He worked as a financial manager in a medium-sized company, a position he achieved after years of dedication. His job was his way of ensuring that he and Emily would never have to worry about money, and he saw it as a show of love. For him, stability was the basis of everything, and he did his best to build this solid foundation. However, this same dedication to work ended up taking him away from the little everyday things that once brought them together. He left early and returned late, and many nights he found himself too exhausted to do anything other than collapse into bed and sleep. Work had become his refuge and his excuse. Emily was a vibrant woman, with an energy that lit up any room. Creative and full of life, she had found in graphic design a way to express all her passion for colors and shapes. Working as a freelancer, she had the freedom to create whatever she wanted and loved exploring new projects. On the other hand, that same freedom sometimes made her feel empty when she looked at James and saw a man who seemed to become more distant every day. For a long time, she tried to convince herself that this was normal, that it was part of the natural wear and tear of any marriage. But her smiles became rarer, and the laughter they shared began to be replaced by a heavy silence. They lived in a comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by friendly neighbors who often invited them to dinners and parties. James and Emily were always the first to be called, the image of the happy couple that everyone wanted to be around. But there was a growing fissure behind this facade, an invisible crack that was slowly opening, threatening to swallow everything they had built. In the eyes of those on the outside, they were still that perfect couple, but things were far from being that simple. James couldn't notice the little signs that Emily left, signs that she wanted more attention, more affection, more connection. He was so focused on securing a stable future that he didn't notice the present was slipping through his fingers. The first years of marriage were magical. They traveled together, tried new restaurants and made plans for the future, plans that seemed so easy to achieve back then. But, over time, the routine began to take a toll. James was sinking deeper into work, and Emily felt like she was losing her best friend. She was trying to make up for the emptiness with new hobbies and projects, but nothing filled the lack she felt. Her close friends noticed that she was more reserved, that her usual enthusiasm had disappeared, but she always made a quick excuse, a forced smile, and changed the subject. One night, after another long and tiring day, James came home and found Emily sitting in the living room, looking at the TV without really paying attention to what was going on. He greeted her with a quick kiss, heading to the kitchen to prepare a sandwich, but stopped when he noticed that she didn't respond immediately. There was a sadness in her eyes that he couldn't ignore, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a weight in his chest. He asked if everything was okay, and she just smiled, saying she was tired. But he knew there was something more there, and for a moment he wanted to ask, but, as always, he chose silence. This scene seemed to repeat itself more and more. The house, which was once full of conversations and laughter, was now filled with the noise of electronic devices and the distant sound of the city. Emily was pulling away, and James felt it, but didn't know how to react. He thought it was just a phase, that everything would soon return to normal. But inside her, something had already changed. She didn't just want security, she wanted someone who made her feel alive, someone who made her smile for no reason, who cared to know how her day was. And try as she might, she couldn't find that in James anymore. Emily started spending more time outside, saying she needed time to herself, to breathe and find inspiration for her projects. Sometimes I would spend hours walking around the city, visiting new cafes, observing the people around me, trying to feel part of something bigger. Other times, she would go to a small art gallery, where she would get lost among the colors and shapes of the paintings, trying to find a meaning that seemed to be disappearing. James didn't notice these escapades, thinking it was just a way for Emily to relax and stay creative. When James noticed that something was changing, he tried to compensate with specific gestures. He brought home flowers for no apparent reason, planned romantic dinners and even suggested a weekend trip to relive old times. Emily thanked her, accepted the flowers, went to the dinners and went on the trip, but nothing seemed to really touch her. Because, no matter how hard he tried, the truth is that those actions came too late. She felt alone and lost, even when she was next to him. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. James felt Emily pulling away, but he didn't know how to stop her, how to bring her back. He wondered if it was his fault, if there was something he could do differently. He thought about taking a leave of absence from work, about finding a way to spend more time with her, but there was always something that came up and prevented him from moving forward with those plans. And so, day after day, he let himself be carried away by the routine, hoping that things would resolve themselves. Emily, in turn, had already stopped waiting. She had found a new refuge, something that made her feel wanted, appreciated, alive. A secret he carried with him, something that gave him a new reason to leave the house, to spend hours outside, to smile in a way that James hadn't seen in a long time. And even though she knew it could destroy everything, she couldn't move away. Because, for her, that was the only thing that made her feel whole, even if it was just an illusion. James and Emily continued living their lives, sharing the same house, the same routine, but each trapped in a different world. He still believed that he could win back the woman he loved, that he could find a way to make her smile at him again the way she used to. But Emily was no longer sure she wanted to go back. And as the days dragged on, they increasingly found themselves like two strangers, unable to find their way back to each other. In the days that followed, James noticed a change in Emily's routine that he couldn't explain. She was more distracted, her mind always seemed to be somewhere else, and her outings became more frequent. He didn't want to be that husband who questioned his wife's every move, and the idea of being controlled by jealousy bothered him. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. He tried to justify it to himself, saying that she needed time, that maybe she was just going through a difficult phase. Still, some nights he would stay up late, waiting for her to return, feeling the heavy silence in the house. Emily, on the other hand, was trying to balance her double life. There were moments when she felt guilty. She looked at James and saw the man she had married, the one who had always treated her with so much affection. But then, there was the other side, a part of her that longed for something different, for an excitement that she could no longer find in her home life. There was someone who made her heart race, who made her feel wanted in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. And she didn't want to give that up, even though she knew she was playing with fire. One night, as Emily was getting ready to leave, James could no longer hold back his doubts. "Are you going out again? I thought we could have dinner together today," he said, trying to sound casual but failing. She hesitated for a moment, long enough for him to realize she was making an excuse. "I am sorry, my love. I arranged to meet a friend. But I promise we'll do it tomorrow," she said, smiling quickly before heading out the door. James stood in the hallway, watching the door close, a sense of loss spreading inside him. He remembered the flowers he had bought her, the dinner he had prepared in an attempt to recreate the simple moments they had shared in the beginning. But nothing seemed to work. It was as if he was trying to reach something that had already been lost. The silence that followed was almost deafening, and James, alone in the house, felt an emptiness he had never felt before. Doubt, which before was just a whisper, now screamed inside him. In the following days, he tried to return to normality. He tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that wouldn't leave him alone, focusing on work and day-to-day tasks. But Emily's absences only increased, and he noticed how she became more careful about hiding her cell phone, how she avoided talking about where she had been. She left the phone on silent, always facing down, and with each unexpected ring, her face seemed to close for a second before returning to her usual smile. James began to wonder if he was becoming paranoid, but his intuition told him something was deeply wrong. One day, while Emily was taking a shower, James saw a notification appear on her cell phone that was left on the couch. He tried to resist the urge to look, but his heart sped up. When he picked up the device and saw the unfamiliar name on the screen, the short and suggestive message, he felt the ground open beneath his feet. It didn't take more than a few seconds to understand what was happening. Every doubt, every sign he had ignored, it all made sense now. He put the phone back in its place, as if the simple act of touching the device could burn his hand. Later that night, as she slept next to him, James tossed and turned in bed, unable to close his eyes. He knew he needed to do something, but he didn't know where to start. Anger mixed with pain made his chest hurt, and he wondered how it all got there. Maybe if I had noticed sooner, if I had done something different, things wouldn't have gotten out of hand. But he knew this line of thinking was a trap. It wasn't his fault. He hadn't chosen to cheat, he hadn't chosen to lie. Over the next few days, James began to observe Emily more closely. He noticed every movement, every excuse she made to leave the house. He never thought he would one day be in this position, trying to find out where his wife was going, who she was with. It was as if he was watching his own life from the outside, as if the person he was had been replaced by a stranger. He knew he needed to be sure, that he couldn't act without knowing the full truth. Finally, one day, he decided to follow her. He felt foolish for doing this, like he was invading her privacy, but he knew there was no other way. That afternoon, he left work early, without telling her, and waited in the car until he saw her leave the house. She drove for a few minutes until she stopped at a cafe on the other side of town. James parked a safe distance away and watched her enter. He tried to convince himself that maybe she really was going to find a friend, that all this doubt was in her head. But then he saw him. A tall, dark-haired man approached Emily and greeted her with a hug that lasted longer than it should have. They exchanged a smile, one that was too intimate to be just friends. James felt his stomach drop. It was as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. He watched as they sat together, talked, laughed. There seemed to be no worry on Emily's face, no guilt, as if she was living a parallel life, one where James didn't exist. He stayed there, motionless, inside the car, watching the two. The pain in his chest felt like a knife being slowly stabbed in, and he didn't know how to react. There were no screams, no tears, just a terrifying silence that enveloped him, like a dense fog. He waited until the two of them left the cafe together, laughing at something one of them had said, and then followed them to a nearby hotel. When he saw Emily walk in with him, without hesitation, he knew there was no turning back. James stood there, staring at the hotel entrance, unable to believe what his eyes were seeing. He felt small, betrayed, as if the world had closed in around him. At some point, he picked up the phone and dialed the man's number. His heart was beating so hard it felt like it was about to explode. And when the call was answered, he heard the calm and carefree voice on the other end. James couldn't stop thinking about the last time he'd seen Emily walk into that hotel, arm in arm with another man. For days, he wavered between anger and sadness, caught in a whirlwind of emotions he couldn't control. He felt a suffocating pain that prevented him from focusing on anything, as if he were trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But, no matter how much he tried to escape that reality, he knew he needed answers. So he did something he never thought he would be able to do, he called Emily's lover. When the call was answered, James was silent for a moment, just listening to the breathing on the other end. He didn't know how to start, what to say, but he knew he needed to know what was really happening. "I know who you are," he said finally, his voice low, controlled. "And I know what you're doing to my wife." Silence on the other end was followed by a hesitant, almost shocked response. What do you want?" James took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I want answers. I want to know how long this has been going on. And I want to know what you really want with her." He heard the man stutter, trying to form a coherent response. "Look, this isn't what you think. I'm very sorry. I never wanted." Before he could finish, James cut in, his voice cold and hard as steel. "Do you want her? You can keep it. I'm divorcing her now." On the other end of the line, the silence was piercing. But then, what James hadn't expected happened. The lover hesitated, and his voice changed. I don't know if I want this." James felt his blood boil. "What are you saying?" He heard the man take a deep breath, as if he was gathering the courage to respond. I didn't want it to go this far. I didn't plan any of this." There was something in his voice, a hesitation that indicated more than just regret. And that's when James realized, there was something he didn't yet know. After the call, James couldn't rest. He knew there was a missing piece to this puzzle. Determined to discover the truth, he took drastic action. The next morning, while Emily was still sleeping, he took her phone and found her lover's number. He went straight to the company where he knew he worked. When he arrived, he stayed outside, waiting until the man left for lunch. He saw him cross the street and enter a small cafe, and he followed him. As he approached, the man raised his head in surprise, and his expression turned pale as he recognized James. "We need to talk," James said, sitting down at the table without asking permission. The man seemed nervous, but made no move to leave. James stared at him, trying to find some explanation on his face, some justification for all this betrayal. "Why did you hesitate yesterday? Why don't you want to be with her? Weren't you too happy together?" The man looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with his hands, looking away. This isn't simple. It never was for me. I think I got more involved than I should have. And now I don't know how to get out of this. James couldn't believe what he was hearing. So you're just messing with her? Pretending you care? He expected the man to deny it, to say everything was wrong, but the expression on his face only confirmed his suspicions. I didn't want to hurt you, the lover said finally, his voice low and remorseful. But, there's something you don't know. James felt his stomach drop. He had prepared himself to face many things, but he was not ready for a new secret. And what don't I know? He pressed, his eyes fixed on the man, who finally lifted his head and met James's gaze. She came to me, James. She came to me because, she was tired of being left aside, of being ignored. And I was going through a difficult time too. But I realized that for her, this was more than just an affair. She was planning something. And I don't know if I can be a part of that. The words came out hesitantly, almost as if he was carefully choosing what he could reveal. James felt the weight of his lover's words settle on him, but he still couldn't understand what he meant. Planning what? What did she want? The man looked away again, as if he was afraid to say. She talked about leaving you. She said she was tired of everything, that she wanted a new life. I thought it was just a rant, but then I realized she was serious. She wanted to use our relationship to pressure him into accepting this. And if you didn't accept it, she wanted to ruin you. James felt the impact of those words like a punch to the gut. He tried to process what he was hearing, but each sentence seemed more absurd than the last. Ruin? What are you talking about? The man took a deep breath, finally looking at James. She knew you were about to be promoted, that your position in the company was important. She said if you found out about us, you would do anything to avoid a scandal, to keep your reputation intact. She wanted money. She wanted you to pay her to leave, and was using our case as a way to achieve that. James couldn't believe what he was hearing. That doesn't make sense, he said, his voice weak, as if the words were being sucked out of him. Why would she do that? We had a life together. I loved her. The lover sighed, his eyes filled with resigned sadness. I think deep down she loved you too. But she was lost. I can't justify what she did. And I don't know if I can continue to be a part of that. James fell silent, his lover's words echoing in his mind. Emily had used the case to try to blackmail him, to destroy everything he had worked to build, just to escape the life they had created together. There was an emptiness inside James that seemed to grow by the second. He realized that he no longer knew the woman he had married, that the person next to him had transformed into someone he didn't recognize. He stood up, feeling like he needed to get out of there, needed air. The lover called to him, his voice low and hesitant. James, I'm so sorry. I really feel it. And if you want to tell everything, if you want to expose the truth, I understand. But I'm out of it. I don't want to be part of her plan anymore. James looked at the man for a long moment before responding, his voice cold and emotionless. You have no idea what you did. None of you have. But I'll deal with it. He turned and left the cafe, not looking back as his mind raced with what he had just discovered. Not only had Emily betrayed his trust, but she was planning to use that betrayal as a weapon against him, to get everything she could before disappearing. As he walked the streets, lost in thought, James knew there was one last thing he needed to do. He needed to confront her. I needed to look into her eyes and hear the truth from her mouth. And only then, when he had all the pieces of this puzzle, could he decide what to do next. James came home that day with his mind racing, his steps heavy as he walked through the entrance hall. With each step, reality became clearer and more relentless. He knew he would have to confront Emily, but what he didn't know was how to stay calm while doing so. He had been betrayed, manipulated, and worst of all, used as a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. But now, he finally had a grasp of the board, and he needed to play his cards accurately. When he entered the house, the silence seemed thicker than ever. Emily was in the kitchen, distracted, preparing dinner, without realizing that James had arrived. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her from behind, trying to find something about her that he could recognize, something that would explain why all this happened. But he saw nothing but a woman who, just a few weeks ago, he believed was his partner, his accomplice, someone he could trust with his life. Now it all seemed like a farce. "Emily," he said, his voice low but firm. She turned around, surprised, and the smile she had when she saw him quickly faded when she noticed the expression on his face. There was something dark in his eyes, a weight she had never seen before. "We need to talk," James continued, without looking away. She hesitated, her hand still holding the spoon she used to stir something in the pan. "Of course, about what?" She tried to look casual, but the tension was evident. James crossed the kitchen, stopping a few meters from her, with an expression that mixed sadness and determination. "About you. About us. About him." The words came out like punches, each one hitting its target with precision. He saw her face change, shock and guilt mixing into an expression he had never seen before. But she didn't say anything. She stood there, still, as if she didn't know what to do. James moved a little closer, keeping his tone controlled but implacable. "I know about the case. I know about the lies, the excuses, everything. But what I want to know is why. Why did you do this, and why were you planning to destroy me in the process?" Emily blinked a few times, as if she was trying to understand what he was saying, as if the gravity of the words weren't enough to snap her out of her daze. "James, she began, but he raised his hand, cutting her off. "Don't say you're sorry. Don't come with excuses. I want the truth. Just that." There was an almost palpable silence in the room, a moment when everything seemed to stop, before she finally spoke. "I don't know," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what came over me. I felt trapped, like I was living someone else's life. And when he showed up, it was like I could breathe again, like I had a chance to be someone different." She tried to hold back the tears, but she couldn't. "I never wanted to hurt you, I never wanted it to be like this." James felt a lump form in his throat, but he wasn't going to let that derail him. "And why did you need to ruin me to get out? If you wanted to leave, why didn't you just say so?" The question was simple, but the weight of it seemed to crush Emily. She took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Because I knew you wouldn't let this happen easily. I knew you would fight to keep it all together, even if I didn't want it anymore. And I was scared. Fear of losing everything, of having nothing later." The confession came out like a torrent of emotions, and James realized that, for the first time, he was seeing a vulnerable Emily, stripped of her defenses. But instead of sympathy, he felt only emptiness. "So you wanted money." "I wanted to make sure I could get out and start again without having to worry," he said, his words sharp. "And for that, you used me, betrayed me, and tried to blackmail me." She shook her head desperately. "I wasn't thinking straight. I got lost in the middle of it all. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I thought that maybe, if I made you realize how unhappy I was, you would let me go without a fight." She hesitated, searching James's eyes for some understanding. But all he found was implacable coldness. James was silent for a moment, processing everything he had heard. He realized that, despite everything, there was a certain sense of logic to her madness, a desperate desire to escape a life that no longer made her happy. But that didn't change the fact that she had chosen the most destructive path possible to achieve this. And in the process, she had destroyed him too. He sighed, finally breaking the silence. "You always had a choice, Emily. I never forced you to stay. If you wanted to leave, you could have left. But you decided to turn it into a game, a contest to see who would come out on top. And now, I don't know if I can look at you the same way. She sobbed, tears now running freely down her face. James, I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right. I know I made a mistake. I know it's too late, but I still love you. And I want to try, even if it's hard. I just need you to give me a chance. He watched her for a moment, and for the first time, he realized how small, how fragile she looked. But he knew he couldn't let compassion overshadow the reality of what she had done. It's not a question of love, Emily, he said, his voice low but firm. It's a question of trust. And you broke that in a way I don't know can be fixed. She looked at him, desperation in her eyes as if she were trying to find some hint that he could forgive her, that all was not lost. But James couldn't bring himself to give her that. He had been betrayed, deceived, and the revelation that it was all part of a plan to manipulate his life and his future had broken something inside him that he didn't know how to repair. Finally, he took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. You always knew you could count on me, that I would be by your side. And yet, you chose to play with me. I'll give you what you want, Emily. I'll sign the papers, I'll let you out. But the one thing I can't give you is what you lost, my trust. She shook her head, the tears continuing to fall, knowing that nothing she said could change what she had done. She wanted to speak, but she couldn't find the words, and so she just stood there, motionless, watching as James turned and left the kitchen. As he walked through the house, he felt the weight of the last few hours on his shoulders, but somehow he also felt a strange sense of freedom. He knew he was about to face the unknown, that there was still a lot of pain ahead. But for the first time, he felt like he had regained control over his own life, that he was no longer a piece in the game Emily had created. And as the door closed behind him, he knew that, as painful as it was, the worst was yet to come. James remained silent in the car for long minutes, staring at the road in front of him, but not really seeing anything. Emily's words still echoed in his head, and he knew that this would be the end of their marriage, but not of all the pain she had caused. He hadn't expected his life to change so drastically in such a short period of time, and although he had taken the definitive step of saying he would sign the divorce papers, he felt he still needed to find some way to resolve all of this within himself. Over the next few days, things happened quickly. Emily tried to stay in touch, calling and sending messages to try to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but James wouldn't budge. For him, it was too late to apologize. He was determined to move forward, even if it meant facing the unknown alone. He met with his lawyer and began divorce proceedings. Each signature, each document was a step towards closing a phase of his life that he never thought would end this way. Emily, in turn, felt the world crumble around her. She didn't know how to deal with James' rejection, with the loss of the security and stability he always represented for her. As much as she had fooled herself into thinking she could control the situation, now everything was slipping through her fingers. She tried to continue with the life she had built with her lover, but soon discovered that he was moving further and further away. After all, he didn't want to be part of this, he didn't want to be one of the protagonists of a scandal that could ruin not only James' life, but his own. One day, Emily received a brief, cold message, "We need to talk." She knew that conversation would be the end, and her heart sank when she saw his name on the phone screen. When they arrived at the cafe where they had met so many times, he didn't try to disguise his intention. "I'm out of it," he said bluntly. "I can no longer continue with you knowing that this will harm everyone around us. And to be honest, I think you should deal with this alone." Emily was in shock, unable to formulate a response. He simply abandoned her there, in the same place where so many lies began, leaving her alone to face the consequences of her actions. Without support, Emily found herself with no way out. She had lost James, and now the lover she used as an escape valve was no longer by her side either. She spent weeks reflecting on the choices she had made, trying to understand where everything had started to fall apart. She knew that, deep down, she had been driven by fear, fear of losing herself, of being forgotten, of being trapped in a life that no longer made her happy. But in an attempt to escape this fear, she destroyed everything around her, including herself. James, on the other hand, began to find a new way of living. He went back to work, and although it was difficult to face the routine and familiar faces after everything that had happened, he knew he needed to keep moving. One day, he received an unexpected message from an old friend he hadn't seen in years, someone who knew what had happened and wanted to know how he was doing. They arranged to go out for coffee and, for the first time in months, James felt comfortable to vent about everything that had happened. "I never thought I would go through this," he said, absent-mindedly stirring his coffee cup. "But you know, in a way, it freed me. It forced me to look at my life and see the things I was ignoring. The things I needed to change, even though it was painful." The friend listened to him attentively and, in the end, smiled. "I don't know what the future holds for you, but I know you will find a way. And maybe, this time, it will be something you choose for yourself, without holding on to what could have been." Those words stuck with James for a long time. He began to realize that as much as the past still haunted him, it didn't need to be defined by it. He started making small changes, focusing on himself, on rebuilding his life and his confidence, one step at a time. The divorce proceedings were finalized, and James suddenly found himself with a freedom he didn't know how to use. He sold the house where they lived, not wanting to maintain any physical ties to the memories that were there, and moved to a smaller apartment, where he could begin to rewrite his story. In the first few days, the silence was unbearable, but he knew it was a necessary silence, a space so he could finally listen to his own thoughts, without interference. Emily, however, was not so lucky. Without James and without her lover, she found herself lost, without the safety net she always thought she would have. She tried to get back to work, but found that she couldn't concentrate, that everything seemed meaningless. She began frequenting bars and places she previously avoided, hoping to find some kind of comfort, but each night only seemed to reinforce the void she had created in her life. Eventually, she decided to leave the city, needing a fresh start away from everything and everyone who knew her story. But even with the distance, she knew that the scars she had caused herself would not disappear so easily. Meanwhile, James began to realize that, as painful as the end of his marriage had been, it had been necessary for him to find himself again. He began to get involved in new projects, to travel, to explore things that he had previously not allowed himself to do because he was stuck in the routine and expectations of a failing marriage. He didn't know if he would ever love someone the same way again, but he was willing to try, one day, when he felt ready. And so, James and Emily's lives took opposite paths. She, marked by wrong choices and trying to find some form of redemption, and he, seeking to rebuild what had been destroyed, with the hope that, one day, he would find a new way of living and loving, without fear. What remained of this story was a bitter but necessary lesson, that no matter how much we try to hide or manipulate the truth, it always finds a way to surface, and that the price of betrayal, whatever it may be, is always more higher than we imagine. And so ends this intense story full of twists and turns. Now, we want to know, what did you think? Comment below and share your opinion. And, if you like this narrative, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. Remember, here on the channel, we do not support any type of betrayal. Our fictional stories serve to show the painful consequences that these actions can have on people's lives. Until the next story.